fun fact for the Twitter handle is the pronunciation of Andrea's
right.
last name. He's an associate professor at Simon Fraser University, where you also got your PhD originally. Right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, so, and you can see Andrea is also affiliated with Google as well as the University of Toronto, and spent a fair bit of time, I think, at Google and also the University of Victoria prior to joining Simon Fraser. And so I think a lot of you have probably seen a lot of Andrea's work because he's done really a lot of impactful work in the visual computing area. And there's a lot of best paper awards, more than I can count. So you guys who are more familiar with geometry processing might have seen Andrea's work on BSPNet. And then he's also had more recently work like mobile NeRF, pixel splat, lots of very cool work. And obviously everybody here is very excited to hear about what Andrea has to say about RadFilm.
Thank you, Angie, for the kind introduction. And of course, it's a pleasure to be here. This is one of the most prolific labs in the world for 3D vision. So it's an honor to be speaking here. So so today I'm going to talk about RadFilm, and I spent a fair amount of time yelling at ChatGPT to generate a scene made of foam, and it took me a good 45 minutes of prompt tuning to actually achieve that. And ChatGPT was not my first stop, by the way. I started from some friends to do that, but I was pretty happy with the result. If you see the picture in the back. So today, I want you to present this new paper. So this has actually been one of the largest research projects of the lab for the past year, and it was I believe it was a very high risk but potentially high reward. And so I'm really excited to display to you. So in general, I'm very excited about 3D reconstruction. So this is a scene from Ben that you can now find on Google Maps on the reconstruction of restaurants. So the applications of these models go anywhere from having and building immersive worlds for VR to building more immersive experience for mapping and navigation, right? So, but now the question is like, this cannot be just it. Why do I work on what I do? And the reason is because I find that 3D computer vision is at the core of perception. So in particular, if you think about as we perceive the world and we can operate within the world with an increased number of degrees of freedom, we start from computer vision from a few years ago where, you would just put a camera on a pole observing the world, and that was it, right? And then in the early 2010s, the vibe on having autonomous systems like autonomous driving, where you have a 2 degree of freedom in the world, started to take traction. And there we wanted to understand the 3D world much better, right? Because we want to avoid our vehicle hitting something else. And my take in general is that 3D computer vision would be essential because as we move toward higher degree of freedom systems, we need a very dense perception of what we're actually looking at. So that's why I do what I do. And then I like to do these take on histories, right? So how do we get from whatever we on the left and one on the right, right? So we have like very well-known systems, so we know how to figure out where cameras are, right? So I'm going to give this part of the problem completely for granted. There is other works or other people and other research team that work on it. I'm going to give it for granted, but this is from Build the ROM in a Day, which means that already back in the late 2000s, we were able to actually calibrate the extrinsics of the camera offline. Then we moved over to some parts of research development over which this lab actually had a fair amount of impact with Matthias in his early days with Kinect Fusion, right? And there we moved towards real-time systems that were able to build dense maps rather than sparse in real time, right? But then, of course, the quality of the geometry that you will produce, as you see here, was not particularly high. And then a few years later, about 10 years later, actually, thanks to the wonders of volumetric rendering with NeRF, thanks again, whoever, I think it was Matt that built this little video for NeRF, we were able to build a representation that starting from just images and by casting array within the volume, will be able to build a 3D representation of the scene. And so now what you ask yourself is like, how come before we used the sensors and now we moved over to just use images? And you can repose this question in other ways, like, after 4 or 5 years after NeRF, what is left of NeRF, right? That's the core question. And really there is 2 bits of NeRF that are left. So the first one is the ability or the necessity for you to be able to model view dependence effects and explain them directly within your model, right? So if you don't do that, then your model is going to have to work with geometry perhaps to compensate for that, and then your reconstruction will look really bad. And here I'm just showing you an example of this view dependence effect rendered with a still camera. And the second bit was employing volume rendering as a way of sending image rendering differences with respect to the ground truth from the pixel all the way within the volume, right? So to be able to backpropagate the entire volumetric, the entire volume or the entire working volume with respect to a measurement in screen space. And so now you can ask yourself, okay, now that these bits of core technology were developed, it's like what people do with it. People were completely nuts, right? So people explored the topic of neural rendering and extending NeRF in all possible types of direction, from modeling 4D dynamics to modeling quantities in the Fourier domain by accounting for smoothness, to having forward models, to having robustness, to having extracting surfaces, all sort of things, right? And I'm going to go back to this slide a little bit later on. So now what I would like you to do, though, is I think about the last 4 or 5 years, and you can ask yourself, is like, where were the biggest jumps in terms of what you could do with the models, right? And I chose myself, you might put the axis somewhere else, but I chose myself on these 2 different axes, right? So training speed and rendering speed. And so I'm going to put 4, I wouldn't say key papers, because one of them is mine, and that will be arrogant, but 2 papers or 4 papers that I think are important from this point of view within this axis, right? So we started from NeRF, when we took about 24 hours of training time to obtain a single scene, and it will not be able to be rendered on a consumer device, right? So that's where we started from. And then a few years later, about a year and a bit later, we ended up in Instant GP, where the training performance got brought down to 5 seconds at a minimum, up to a handful of seconds or minutes to reconstruct the scene at a high quality. And then we moved over to also deploying systems that were able not only to train efficiently, but at this time it was able to render efficiently and on consumer level devices, right? So we explored these 2 directions kind of separately. And really, like, you ask yourself, is like, what was one of the most important papers of the last 2 years? It was Gaussian Splatting, because this was one of the first systems that combined the 2 axes simultaneously in such a way that you would be able to train something that would train fast, that will render fast, and even most importantly, you have a single representation that can do both things simultaneously without requiring any distillation, right? And so it's also kind of interesting that every paper on this page actually won an award of some sort, which is why I picked these 2 axes of exploration in identifying them. So just as a recap, if you're not familiar, although in this room, I'm sure that you are. So to go and understand why NeRFs were slow to train is that you casted these rays and you sample quantities along this ray, a lot of samples. And for each of these samples, you have to evaluate a big neural network, right? So each neural network on its own is not particularly expensive, but when you have to evaluate hundreds and thousands of query points, millions within a batch, then the performance of training will decay. So then we moved over to INGP, where we, rather than using these larger networks, we use shallower networks, and we traded off compute for storage, right? So we started storing quantities within grids and multi-resolution grids, and interpolating quantities, and then using a shallow neural network to convert the quantities in this grid to the quantities that NeRF used to train. One of the other axes of exploration was fast rendering. So in mobile NeRF, we showed that by using rasterization, right, a lot of the problems due to rendering could then be executed extremely fast, right? Because you're using part of the rasterization pipeline to bring your representation to screen space and being composited efficiently. But this was, of course, only for rendering, right? So to be able to build these representations, you still had to train a classical model and distill back into it. And this is really where Gaussian splatting came in, where training and rendering were happening within a shared representation, and both parts of the pipeline were executing very efficiently, right? I'm not going to go into the details, but the core of the representation, as you know, is based on taking millions of Gaussian splats, as you can see right here in 3D, and finding a way of efficiently projecting them to screen space and then compositing them using alpha blending. And so if you think about what we were doing at the time, just before Gaussian splatting came out, is that we were trying to extend mobile NeRF to the next paper, right? To the next version of the paper that was more powerful, more flexible, faster to train, and so on. And we were working on something that's called quadrature fields. And I think the best picture that summarizes what happened to the line of work is this. So that's George Kopanas, by the way, and I should put two two photos over here rather than one. But basically, everything that we were doing, I think we had about 6 or 7 papers running at a time within the NeRF ecosystem. And yeah, sure, we had to finish them, but it was pretty clear that if we didn't want to be dinosaurs, we had to update our backend, right, to be more up to date with what people needed. So thank you, George, for making my life hard for about a year. But now you have to ask yourself, is it true that this 3D Gaussian splatting system give you everything that you need, right? Because that's a fairly valid question, right? I'm not willing to abandon ship and move to something else unless I'm really convinced that I get absolutely everything that I want within the new domain that I'm trying to explore. And so I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to ask what is the elephant in the room from the point of view of Gaussian splatting. And I'm going to give you a laundry list of things that goes wrong and then people have been working on to fix, right? So the first one is, for example, that because you're using Gaussians to represent your data, Gaussian are compact supported functions, right? And so whenever you don't have a Gaussian where you need it, it's very hard to place one there. So the original paper used both strong initialization coming from some external system like SFM to properly initialize your data, as well as all sort of heuristics to increase the density of the Gaussians wherever the gradient-based optimization was not able to move, right? So that was the first one. And so we did some work in there, which I'm going to show in a second, MCMC. But there is many other problems, right? So we moved from modeling reconstructions as functions defined within the volume, for which implicit functions like STF could be built. But then we moved over to Gaussian splatting, which were, on the other hand, these pointwise quantities that didn't really admit a volumetric interpretation. And so a lot of people spend time on how to represent surfaces within this representation, right? Not nearly as easy as when you were using a NeRF-like backend. And then, of course, like all of the approximation that made Gaussian splatting efficient, sure, you can render efficiently, but you actually broke a number of the assumptions about the consistency of the representation with respect to 3D. And in particular, you have these popping artifacts that I will show in a couple of seconds. So as you will move slightly your camera rotating at about a point, you will see splats that will come in and out of visibility, causing very visible artifacts in there. And then finally, like if you want to go and optimize for global illumination, right? So if you want to understand things like materials, if you want to understand like things like second bounds, illuminations or shadows, is much harder to do within a rasterization pipeline, right? So this is just a laundry list. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples that me and other groups have been doing just to make you understand that this representation requires a lot of babysitting to tackle all of these problems, right? So for example, in the first one of this work, which is what we've done in the 3DGS MCMC, where MCMC stands for Marco Chain Monte Carlo, we showed that we can actually introduce noise within the optimizer in such a way that we can use a very weak initialization of the system and still converge to a high quality result. And again, this is caused by the fact that these Gaussians that you're seeing on the left on the screen are only locally representing information. And so as soon as you are outside of the compact support of the function, your gradients with respect to the photometric reconstruction will be numerically zero, right? So if you don't have a Gaussian where you need it, there is no way for you to put easily there. And what we did in this paper, I'm not going to go into details right here, but it's basically telling a Gaussian that whenever you're not locked in by the reconstruction process, you're free to explore the environment or respawn in some useful region of space, right? So we're using a bit of randomness to have Gaussians random walk in the environment until they latch onto something useful. So that was the key of this paper. Then another line of work, this is not done by my lab. It's like, I wish I did it, but unfortunately not. This is a beautiful piece of work from Andreas Geiger's group at Tübingen. And what they did is that saying, well, if I want to reconstruct surfaces rather than volumes, right? Volumetric quantities, actually, to be specific. What I can do is that rather than using an actual anisotropic 3D Gaussian that represents a volumetric function, I can instead use flattened Gaussians onto a planar splat, right? So they introduce this concept of 2D Gaussians, and then they have a way of splatting all of these Gaussians into an implicit function, from which then we can extract a surface using a kinect fusion-like process, okay? But again, the process of going from these planar splat representation and then extracting a surface is done kind of as an afterthought, right? As a posteriori post-process the representation. So we're not going to go end-to-end completely through it. So this is just to give you an idea that this, to my opinion, is still the best attempt, by the way, at extracting surfaces with Gaussian splatting. And despite the fact that I find the paper is quite nice and we're using and extending it right now, I do not think this is the final answer to the problem, right? So just trying to motivate. And then perhaps one of the topics that over the last year people have been touching a lot is the problem of popping, right? So right now on the right, these artifacts are being amplified. So they're colored in violet whenever they happen, rather than the original color, just to make it more evident. And by the way, I was talking with Limpinski a couple of days ago, and he was highlighting how small visual artifacts that might seem minor within a video that you show on screen get amplified massively as soon as you present this content in VR, okay? So while these might, okay, fine, it's a small popping artifact, so what? But now imagine living in a virtual environment where these popping artifacts happen all the time as you move your viewpoint, and there's structural noise, right? Because it's conditional on the position of your head, then you're going to be able to, or it's going to be fairly distracting to have these artifacts. And the reasoning, you can see it on the left, right, is because these 3D Gaussians, so this is a 2D depiction of the 3D scene, and the sorting of the Gaussian that is used to do compositing of the image happens according to the mean position of the center of the Gaussian with respect to the camera, okay? And so what happens is that as soon as the mean of the first Gaussian is in front of the second, you see on the left that the colors swap completely. And this, of course, causes a lot of artifacts, and there's been lots of papers that try to fix this problem. The first one that I know of is the Stop the Pop paper from some of the same authors of Gaussian splatting. And actually, in the next image, I show you what these popping artifacts look like in a normal session. So you can see right here. So imagine you're looking down at this table, and now the color of the surface of the table changes slightly and pops in and out in a very discontinuous way as you're rotating the camera about a point. Okay? And of course, there has been multiple papers that try to solve this problem. So for example, this Ever paper from our sister group at NVIDIA tried to solve it, but in trying to solve it, what they had to do is that to actually apply ray tracing operations using external libraries, right? So sure, you can use this NVIDIA optic pipeline to remove popping artifacts from your representation, but as soon as you do that, now your implementation of the rendering time can only execute on an NVIDIA GPU, right? Suddenly, sure, you fix this problem, but no VR device that doesn't have an NVIDIA GPU on board will be able to exploit this representation. And another example, which would be the last one connected to this one, because it also uses the NVIDIA optic backend to realize effects, is this beautiful work from Toronto, the NVIDIA Toronto team, where they actually used, again, ray trace representation coupled within Gaussian splatting to then be able to render things like shadows and secondary reflections, like you can see in these virtually inserted object within a scene. Okay, but again, to realize this type of insertions, you still have to lean over libraries that allow you to accelerate ray splat intersection tests, right? And to do this efficiently, you have to rely on hardware accelerated libraries for this task. You cannot do it natively. And finally, which is the last kind of like probably the one that I care the most these days, apparently, is how do you do non-trivial projections, right? So if your data does not come from a pinhole-like camera, or there is not an easy transformation that maps the images captured by your camera down to a pinhole mapping, now because the entirety of Gaussian splatting relies on pinhole parameterization, there is not an easy way of doing it. Or better, there is some papers like this 3D paper, and I think there is 2 or 3 more that try to model the nonlinear mapping in between the representation on screen and the one that you have within the camera. But there is a lot more that you can do, right? And again, this is another paper from NVIDIA research, but as you can see, each of these problems requires its own custom solution, right? And now if you imagine imagining a solution where you're solving all of them at the same time, you're gonna have to now band-aid problems left and right to fix them all together, which of course means your code base will become complicated and cumbersome to port over places. So now we're gonna take a different approach to the entire thing, right? So Gaussian splatting, in terms of how you render points to screen space, belong to a chain of research which is called point-based rendering. And so what you should ask yourself is, historically, what happened to point-based rendering? And my best depiction of what happened to point-based rendering is this. Is a symposium, so a special conference that was organized around points-based rendering, that around 2006, 2007, completely disappeared from history, right? And so some of these papers now appear in the Symposium on Geometry Processing and maybe on the Eurographic Symposium on Rendering, but there's no more dedicated conference for point-based representations, right? And most of these representations, especially from the point of view of reconstruction, were completely replaced by methods that, on the other hand, reconstruct surfaces. Okay, so Poisson reconstruction, I think, at least in my head, is the paper that essentially, in some way, killed this entire area of research and replaced it with the realm of implicit functions, right, for extracting surfaces out of point clouds. I don't know if you agree with me, but that's my take. And so now the question is, like, if you now live in the era of point-based neural rendering, you can ask yourself, what is going to be that thing that, just like it happened in 2006, 2007, will replace point-based representations in doing this? And now I'm not saying that what I'm showing you today is that thing, but, which of course is the next slide, by the way. But what I want to do is that I want to prompt you to think about the fact that most of computer graphics relies on meshes, right? Or video models, according to whether you believe whether computer graphics is done or not. And you want to have a process that generates meshes natively, right? So some form of polygonal representation in the backend. And this is where I'm going to introduce radiant foam. Okay, so this is, as I said, is like one of the larger projects within the lab. I follow the pattern of another lab, which I actually encourage everybody to do. And I had more than one student working together simultaneously in the same project, which I think is more fun and aiming for faster iteration time. But that said, it's like two people full time. You will understand why in a couple of slides. It took about a year of time to get this done. So this is a very big investment within my lab. And this is work done, led by Shri and Daniel. So they're both my most senior and I guess a mid-career PhD student within my lab, and co-advised by Kwang at UBC. Okay, so let's talk a little about motivation. Right? So I built this long chain of papers, so now you should have a little bit of context. So I said that the magic behind NeRF was volume rendering, right? That's what allowed you to send gradients from the pixel domain down into the volume to then update your representation. And so if I tell you this, the first thing you should do is that you should go down to physics and understand where on earth the equations of NeRF come from, right? And what are the underlying assumptions of those equations. So if you do that, after a couple of pages of algebra, you end up with these equations. And then if you work under the assumption of piecewise constant density and piecewise constant radiance, then you derive the equations that you find in the typical NeRF paper, right? And I somehow, as being somebody that did engineering, for me, discretization is something that you do at the very end of the day. But when you talk about math, you usually talk or try to stick to the continuous model as much as possible. So it always bothered me when people wrote equations down here rather than the continuous counterpart. And so what you can do is that you can actually go back in time and rederive these equations. And for you, together with Ben, we prepared this technical report. If you're curious to do that, I think by now we've wrote 7 papers after really understanding, after writing that small tech report, the knowledge that I got from reading it or from writing it, resulted in about 6 to 7 papers today. But then the question is, it really allows you to understand what's happening within the representation, right? And the cool thing is that as we were preparing the technical report, we were reading this older technical report, because the techniques were actually from the 70s, that actually described the entire process of volume rendering as coming from the one of ray tracing to tetrahedral meshes. Okay? And this is key and critical, right? The entirety of the equations that you see on the left, both the continuous and especially the discrete. So the continuous one, of course, are valid for continuous media. But as soon as we move to the slides at the bottom, okay, what I'm assuming is that I have a volume that has been partitioned in sets in space, where within a particular bounded region of space, I find constant density and constant radiance. So that's a key assumption of this discretization step. And so if you don't respect it, you get something wrong out of it. And in fact, actually, if you think about the proposal network, so this is the architecture slide out of mid-NeRF 360, the proposal network of NeRF violates this assumption, right? And it violates in a very tricky way, right? Because along array, right, the proposal network partitions the domain in segments, you can see here on the left, within which you assume the radiance and density are constant, right? But now the partition that one array performs via the proposal network is not the same partition that another array performs, right? So the partitioning of the volume within piecewise constant media is actually not realized by construction. So you're violating physics as soon as you're doing that, right? So you're taking the equation and the discretization that you had right here at the bottom, and now this is in theory not valid, right? So that's one important bit. So now the question is like, okay, what was the representation that actually didn't violate this property? And what was it designed for? Again, you can do a bit of spelunking, you can go back in time, and it was designed for something that in 2D, by the way, I don't draw in 3D because I can't. I don't know if you have special skills, but I can't. So I'm going to draw in 2D. But it was designed for domains that look like this. It was designed to render volumetric media defined on a polygonal mesh. Okay? And the key part of this representation is that for every point in space, there is one corresponding point within one particular polygon that represents that point. And so my volumetric mesh, which in this case is a surface, is volume within the plane, let's call it that way, okay? The area of the plane. This mesh is injective parameterization of space, right? So every point in the space has one and only one point within one polygon that represents it, okay? And this means that now this polygonal mesh is fully representing the embedding space, R2 in this case, or R3 in the case of NeRF, without any ambiguity, okay? So this is the part. And then when you render, so if I want to now execute those equations, I'm going to trace array within this volumetric mesh. And what I'm having is that I'm having that within each of these colorful polygons, I'm going to measure from here to here is going to be the integral of a constant density and a constant radiance, right? So this is what the equations of NeRF were designed to do. And so it would be nice if we can get back to a representation where actually these core hypotheses of volume rendering actually holds. So now let's assume that somebody, some oracle, told you that the best way of representing the domain is the mesh that you see right now on screen, right? So ignore initialization for now. Just say that I gave you this mesh, and now you're going to have to refine it. So now the question is that according to the information this green ray gave you, okay, this observation, you will want to modify the position of the vertices to obtain a better parameterization of your volume that is more useful to the task you're performing, right, to the one of rendering. And so now the question is like, okay, I'm going to compute some form of gradients of the position of this vertex with respect to the rendering loss, and I'm going to apply it. And so the question you should ask yourself is that if this is my reality and I apply my gradient update, is what can go wrong in this representation? I'm not taking questions live in the talk because we're streaming, but I'm going to give you the answer to this question instead. Well, what could go wrong is that if I take, for example, this vertex and I move it along this linear path, as soon as this vertex crosses this edge, I'm going to get a fold over, right? So I'm going to have that happening, which means that all of the regions that are marked in red are now represented by two polygons. Which means that now, if I have some quantity in space and I want to retrieve the degrees of freedom from the original representation, I do not know where I should pick them, for example, from the red triangle for this point here where my cursor is, or from this bigger triangle right here. And so this, from the point of view of optimization, now gives you an ill-posed configuration of my triangulation to retrieve information from. And so you ask yourself, is like, okay, fine. Yes, meshes are hard, by the way. There is this famous quote from this Pixar engineer, meshes are hard. I agree. I try to kill meshes more times than I dare to remember. But meshes are hard, so what can you do with it? So, well, one way of getting rid of meshes is saying, well, polygonal meshes are a function of the position of the vertices. So you have some system that, given the position of these black dots, give you the perfect mesh, okay? So in other words, rather than having a mesh described as the position of the vertices and the connectivity of the vertices, you write the connectivity of the vertices, C, as a function, where's my mouse? see as a function, and this is an oracle, let's say, of the vertices V. And you kind of know, or you must have heard of one such oracle operations, right? That gave you this connectivity. And this operation F is called the Delaunay triangulation. So if you don't know what the Delaunay triangulation is, for a collection of vertices, in this case is this red dot on the left, a Delaunay triangulation creates a triangle, okay? So you have a triangle right here. Whenever you can find a circumcircle in 2D and a circumsphere in 3D that passes through sufficient number of points in 2D is 3, right? So if I find an empty circumcircle in 2D, okay, that means that those 3 vertices are connected by a triangle. Okay, and I create this connectivity right here. Okay, and up to vertices being located in general positions, this construct is unique, so that mapping F actually exists. And you could say, great, now I don't have to optimize my mesh anymore. I'm going to have this oracle system that, as far as you can execute this triangulation operation efficiently, I can get rid of triangulation from my life, right? And the triangles are going to be implicitly defined. So what I'm going to call that function that we had earlier, the Delaunay function of the vertices V. But there is a problem, okay? And I'm going to hint the problem without telling you exactly what it is here at the bottom of the screen. So what is the problem? Well, first of all, how do we solve this problem? Actually, maybe I should have done it the other way around, but how do we solve this problem? Well, the beauty of it is that while the Delaunay triangulation is one of these, let's say, oracle functions that will give you the connectivity of the vertices, it actually has a natural dual operation. And this dual operation is called the Voronoi diagram, okay? So as far as you understood the logic that created the diagram on the left, how do you build the Voronoi diagram on the right? Well, the Voronoi diagram is made of convex cells, okay? So if you notice, each of these cells on the right are convex. Every point within a cell, okay, is closest to the corresponding red point than it is to any of the other points in the environment, okay? But the other cool thing is that the vertices of the convex cell come from the center of the circumcircles of the Delaunay triangulation that we defined earlier. And not only that, but the connectivity in between, or the proximity in between 2 cells is indicated by the existence of an edge in the Delaunay triangulation. So if I have an edge right here in the Delaunay triangulation, then the 2 cells of the Voronoi diagram of the 2 corresponding sites will touch along a facet right here. And so they have a full dual representation. And so converting one into the other and back and forth can be done very, very efficiently. So, okay, now why do we care, right? You can say, well, they're the operations are the dual of each other. So why do I care? If one has problems, so does the other, right? That seems to be a pretty simple thing to say. Well, the thing is that that's not true. Because now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to take this representation. And now what I'm doing is that I'm applying a gradient update to one of the degrees of freedom that I was showing you earlier, okay? So, and as you can see on the left, you're going to have an edge flip whenever the circumcenter condition is not satisfied, and you can show that these result in a local edge flip. Okay, and so what happens is that now, as you're rendering, right, what you're doing, remember, you have this piecewise constants assumption about the world. So when you're rendering, you're tracing array within this representation. Okay, and now look at what happens on the left of the screen. Now this vertex is moving, and it could be moving by epsilon, right? And maybe it's moving with noise. And what this will cause, it will cause a complete change in the partition of the volume of the representation, which means that now, as I perform a continuous change in my representation, I get a discontinuous update within my rendering equation. And so this breaks down everything. So we had this running, I think this was August or end of August, and we were trying to figure out why we were like 1 or 2 dB below state of the art in terms of reconstruction power. And then we had to add another couple of months. I thought we were done at the time, by the way. So we were almost ready to release, and then it's like, oh, what's going on? We looked at the losses in a simplified training setting for 2D, and that's what was happening, right? So we didn't notice, or we didn't notice at the time, that these combinatorial swap resulted in oscillation within the loss. And as you know, it's like if you have oscillation within the loss, typically you cannot produce optimizations that are of as high quality, okay? Conversely, look at what's happening on the right, right? So remember, whenever you're doing rendering, as far as the change to the rendering loss is smooth with respect to the perturbation of the input, you're all good, right? And as you can see on the left, you can imagine moving this red dot very, very slowly, and the contribution of the cell corresponding to the red dot to the length of the segment within this ray will again increase smoothly over time. And so while the representation on the left is not differentiable with respect to the motion of the sites, the representation on the right is completely differentiable with respect to continuous motions of the sites. And that's exactly what we do. We introduce a representation called radiant foam. And by the way, the name might look a bit mysterious to you. The reason is because if you have a foam, a stable foam, so it's not moving, and you assume that the pressure within each of the foam bubbles is constant, you're going to have linear, of course, in the limit, or in a perfect world, you're going to have linear barrier in between two cells. And as you can see, the cells look like convex cells, okay? And so these proxy or this geometry of these foam set that you can see right here is fairly well approximated by Voronoi diagram. And we call it a radiant foam because within each cell of this Voronoi diagram, we have a constant density and a view-dependent radiance. So it's a radiant, it radiates light, right? So each of these bubbles is radiating light in a particular direction. So now what you have to ask yourself is, okay, how do you render? Let's start from a mesh, not from a foam, right? So how do I render this efficiently? So we'll see later, this representation can be rendered at hundreds of frames per second, even without requiring any CUDA acceleration, right? So how is that possible? Well, there was an old paper, which I forgot to add a citation at the bottom of this slide, which showed that if you have an injective parameterization of the volume, like the one you have seen on screen, as far as I know where the ray enters my screen, to be able to render a volumetric process, what it can do is it can walk along the connectivity graph of the diagram, okay, and compounds the densities and radius along the ray to produce the color of a particular pixel. And so by walking along this volumetric mesh, and by the way, because it's injective, there is one and only one order, right? But by walking along these paths, I can now compute the color associated with this particular ray. And now you might say, yeah, okay, but this is a triangular mesh. Like that's not what you have, right? I have a bunch of Voronoi cells. So what do? Well, it's identical. Because remember that I told you that the connectivity of the Voronoi diagram is actually stored within the Delaunay triangulation. And so now I can use the Delaunay triangulation, which is the dual of the Voronoi, to now give me within my shader, right, within my pixel shader, the connectivity graph that a particular ray should walk on to compound the density and radiances along the ray to then produce the pixel color. So there is one more trick in how you actually compute this. It's actually fairly simple. So if I have this bluish cell right here, and this is my ray, right? So the previous cell told me that this is the cell that I'm intersecting against. That's all good. How do I find the entry point of the cell? What I can do is that I take all of the hyperplanes within the convex cell that are facing toward the camera, that are normal, that point in the opposite direction in terms of sign to the red ray. And then amongst all the intersection points of the cell with the facet of the cell with the ray, I take the point that is furthest along the ray to compute the entry point right here. And the exit point is exactly the same routine. So I take the subset of facets that are pointing away from me, which is this green set right here. And amongst all of the intersection points of these facets, I take the one that is closest to me. And I obtain this point. And so in this case, I actually obtain the computation of the entry point and the exit point, which is actually what you need to compute gradients with respect to the vertex of the cell. So this is the only quantity that enters the derivative of the vertex of the cell. So I'm almost done, actually. So I told you the entire representation. Like there's nothing else. That's it. And it has none of the shortcomings that the other representation that you've seen has. So how do you train this representation? Of course, there's a few more whistle and bells that we have to add. So these losses, for now, we have only trained with two losses. The first one is nothing else than photometric reconstruction. You have seen that a million times in any neural radiance or radiance fields paper. And the second one is nothing else than a version of the so-called distortion loss from NeRF-like 360, okay? But while the loss requires you to sample quadratic number of points and relationship in between the elements along array, we propose one that only requires a linear scan. So it's just faster to implement and gives you basically the same quantity. So now the other bit is that, earlier I told you, yeah, we work on these MCMC papers that remove the need for heuristics, for initialization, and we haven't done that yet. We were focusing on building the core representation, the core code base to do it. So we still have heuristics for densification and pruning. But the cool thing is that within a foam, these heuristics are actually much cleaner than what happened in the Gaussian splatting representation case. So in Gaussian splatting and in foam, you have two main operations, right? So you have a scene, you have measured some error or like the amount of error that a Gaussian is representing within the reconstruction, and you have to decide whether to increase the representation power in the location or to decrease the representation power because you have too much. So these are the two main operations. Right? One is densification and the other one is pruning. And now the cool thing is that for densification, this is actually a closed form identity mapping, right? Because if now I have a single site in the Voronoi diagram and I replace it by two sites which are epsilon away from each other, that split this site in a mitosis, almost like a cellular mitosis, as far as the quantities that are stored in these two red dots are the same quantity, up to noise, of course, then the representation before and after the split is identical to the one that I had before. And in the MCMC paper, we showed how preserving this idempotent representation before and after a non-differentiable combinatorial change is essential to converge more effectively. And in the pruning side, it's just a little bit more difficult than in the case of Gaussian splats. What we do is that we say, well, I cannot remove just any point in space because it has low density. No, cannot do that. And the reason is because the cell boundaries, this vertex right here is also, actually, let me do it on the screen so people can see. This vertex right here, when I move it, it will affect the location of all of the cell boundaries right here. And so what I need to do to be able to remove a site, I can remove a vertex from the Voronoi diagram if both the density of these vertex is low and of all of the vertices surrounding. Right, so that's an extra condition that you have to add. 544, yeah, I'm doing pretty good in time. So now I'm going to go to results. There's nothing else for you to learn, right? It's just photometric reconstruction with a bit of distortion loss to make surface harder, and everything else is just eye candy. So now you can take a deep breath and rest a bit. So first thing I'm going to show you is rendering performance, right? So as you can see, it's hundreds of frames per second, not particularly optimized. We didn't give this to a shader whisperer or to a CUDA whisperer that, although Daniel, from that point of view, might be in some sense. And yes, this is actually rendering by walking along the cells of this diagram at 200 FPS. There's no acceleration data structures that are running other than walking along cells. So if you add an acceleration data structure to like factor empty space, probably you can likely add another 0 to the rendering performance of this. The second part is you have to ask yourself, for now, I've shown you boring 2D diagrams of what the internal of the representation is, right? And the next visualization that I'm going to show you is this one. So what I'm showing you right here is that I'm showing you a hyperplane cutting through the foam left and right, with the exception that I'm only emitting light whenever this hyperplane is intersecting an area with high density, right? Just to be able to show you what it is. And then what I'm going to do is that I'm going to slice this very high dimensional diagram and show you what's inside. And that's actually what the internals of the representation is. Okay, so as you can see, it's an injective parameterization of space. Within each of these colorful cells, I'm going to have a constant density and a constant radius. But internally, this representation is a polygonal mesh. It's a polygonal volumetric mesh. And yes, it's not a surface mesh yet, but just ... I'm not going to say much more than that. Okay, it's pretty cool, right? So we spent like a week deciding how to render this video and how to put it on screen. Is like I drove Shri completely crazy, I think, at one point. All right, so yeah, I can move on. And you can see, by the way, that the size of the Voronoi cells would be much smaller as I'm close to the surface and become very, very large in empty space. So in one sense, if you think about something like instant NGP, right? In instant NGP, when you had a hash grid, but you had to refine the density of the hash grid, you were, in a way, controlling the maximal frequency in the frequency domain of your representation, right? Well, in this case, the frequency of the representation is related to the size of the cell. So it's adaptive in frequency, but without needing any hierarchical data structure in the backend. So now the next thing that I'm going to show you is how this trains. And it looks very similar to a classical NeRF training round. So refreshing the connectivity of the diagram is a little bit more expensive. We didn't spend tons of time accelerating yet. It's weird because from this angle, the table doesn't look like the plant is not in the center of the table to me, which is messing up with my visual system. But so this is again the training system converges roughly in the same amount of time that a Gaussian representation is. So there is no need to use one over the other. And also in terms of visual quality, it actually surpasses the basic implementation of 3D Gaussian splatting. Of course, the follow-up, we didn't give up to be yet, but that's not what we're trying to do. So now if I show you what the internals of this rendering look like, this is actually a beautiful visualization that I stole from George from the original Gaussian splatting paper. What I'm showing you here is the laser line from before, except that right now the plane is straight through the z-axis of the camera. And what I'm showing you on the right is that I'm showing you the depth of the model, so the rendering depth, so the expected rate termination caused by the rendering equation on the left. And on the right, I'm showing you the number of cells that have intersected, not intersected, that have parsed through or walked through to be able to render a particular pixel, okay? And now one important thing to notice is that while in Gaussian splatting, whenever you had two Gaussians on top of each other, the original paper was actually not doing proper volumetric integration. The volumetric integration you have right here up to the resolution of the mesh is exact. There's no approximation running anymore in this particular case. So that's one big gain from the point of view. So nothing was saved in respect to approximations other than resolution within the representation. The other bit is that if I now want to represent things that are not easy to do through rasterization. So if you go back to your introduction to graphics class, you know, your faculty, probably Matthias or Angela, I would say, maybe somebody else, I don't know, would have told you that, yeah, you know, ray tracing is really cool and you can do all these advanced effects, but the problem is that it's very, very slow to get a low variance estimate of the radiance coming into the camera, right? And on the other hand, rasterization is very, very fast, yes, but the problem is that there is entire books. There is the Graphic Gems line of books that are designed to explain to you how to get high-level effects or complicated light effects within the rasterization pipelines. And what I'm showing you right here, on the other hand, is that one of the simplest forms of advanced effects that is fairly difficult to do in rasterization will be, for example, inserting an object and bouncing rays, right? So Gaussian splatting is not compatible because you have to render an entire image at once, and so it's not easy to decide to bounce the ray in another direction just for that set of rays that intersect the sphere. On the other hand, within a foam, what happens is that simply you change the way in which you're walking through the diagram as soon as you hit that interface. So the cost of executing this is zero, right? There's nothing for you to do other than reflecting your rays. And similarly, if I have transparencies, exactly the same thing, right? So I can just use the Fresnel equation, and then as soon as I cross the boundary of my sphere, I can redirect the rays and actually do a partial integration of the density in this segment versus this segment in exact form. So there's nothing special for you to do. Or if I want to train my representation with a camera that is not a pinhole camera, right? If I have a 360 camera, nothing happens, because what I can do is that rather than generating a pinhole representation, I can just send out rays in a 360 fashion, and I can now build a representation that can be rendered with rays emanating from a single focal point. There's absolutely nothing for you to do. Okay, so this is more like the eye candy part of it. Of course, we have quantitative evaluation, so you can show that all of the core bits, we try to get rid of as many of them. So if you don't densify, of course, you're going to get a super low quality home representation. If you don't do any pruning, the quality of novel view synthesis is roughly the one that you do it with pruning. But then, of course, the number of sites that you have is going to be a lot larger. If you don't have what is called the quantile regularizer, is the same thing as the distortion loss within NeRF. You're going to have some floaters around because there's nothing that penalizes these like low density chunks of space. And then if you have a full model, everything works just fine. In terms of performance, with respect to other models, as I said, mostly what we were trying to achieve is finding an alternative way of representing 3DGS problems, right? So this was the first row is actually the primary one that we're trying to attack. The asterisk right here, it means that it's not the numbers from the original paper, but it's the numbers that are better, by the way, than the ones from the original paper. So these numbers are higher in PKSNR than they were in the original paper, that we obtained by re-executing the most current version of the code base that the authors published, whereas a few of the bugs and a few of the imperfection initializations were correct. And our objective was to basically show that we can have a ray tracing-like performance, okay, but we can do it in a representation that can be actually rasterized, that doesn't require an actual retracing core to be executed, right? So there was no CODA involved in this representation, which means that if I want to take it and I want to implement it in a pixel shader, so be it, right? Because the graph of the cells that is used for traversing the ray through the system is frozen at test time, and so I can just traverse it easily at test time. So the code for the entire shebang has been public since launch day, and we actually had, this is an old snapshot, we've had PRs coming in left and right to have pipelines, people are volunteering to extend it. And I think the same day that we launched it, like somebody downloaded the code, and this is a YouTube transcoding, so the quality looks bad, mostly because of streaming, because this is not downloaded. This is actually from, it's a YouTube page. But yeah, so people were able to, yeah, so you can fetch these this scene in online, and it actually was quite a bit larger scale than we ever tried in the original paper, because we were mostly using the standard benchmarks. And in terms of future research, is like, remember how I had this slide that showed you all of the papers that showed extensions to NeRF and Gaussian splatting? Be my guest. We are picking our battles, and we're going to go down one or two of them. Give us a hand. Feel free to reach out. We're happy to help you in extending in any of this direction. And I still have roughly 7 minutes, and I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
So it's really cool. I guess the question is like, how do you actually initialize it? Is that looks like you use like transformation points?
Yes. So to get still, because we were trying to compare apple to apples with 3DGS, the basic comparison was initializing in the same way, just to keep a fair game. Now, the cool thing is that while a Gaussian splat is it's only defined locally, right? Because the gradients of a Gaussian splat are only within the 3 times the standard deviation of the splat. The gradients in the representation are globally supported. Because if I don't have a point somewhere yonder in the environment, I'm going to have a corresponding much larger cell, and that cell will receive gradients with respect to the representation. So I can actually measure the amount of error that cell is causing.
Yeah.
And so I actually can initialize it with just random noise, just like MCMC.
So if you initialize with structure for motion point, is it that basically each point is actually one cell?
Yeah.
And then basically...
And you scatter some points around it just to keep the cell somewhat smaller. Yeah. Yeah.
Where do you stand in terms of memory efficiency, like how much space it will take?
So there was the computation of the updates to the Voronoi diagram. Those were the ones that took a little bit more memory. This is something we're improving over time, but it's not significantly different from 3DGS or other pipelines.
In the final construction is basically similar to 3DGS?
Yeah, it's basically on par. Yeah. Yeah. So we try to be on par on everything, minus the fact that we can actually give you ray tracing performance within the representation. Yeah. And a bunch of things that the other models could not do. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe in terms of a research project, like what was the initial idea of the project? You told your 2 students, okay, I give you 1 year of time, take these 3 axes and...
Yeah, so the initial, so it's a bit complicated. So we just finished Lagrangian hashing, which was with Shri, the first author, and Lagrangian hashing was, so if you look at Lagrangian hashing, oh, this looks like 3DGS. It's like, yeah, but it wasn't built after 3DGS. It was built before 3DGS. And it was, back in the days when we were doing NeRF, my thought was like, this cannot be it. We must have some form of like localized representation. So Shri came from there, right? Just finished Lagrangian hashing, and then we had to cope with the fact that the DGS came out, and we're thinking for the next project. Then Daniel had just finished another project that the DGS killed, which was neural field distributions, which now that MIPS splatting came out, wasn't needed anymore because MIPS splatting can achieve very similar results. And Daniel really wanted to build representations for which describing the behavior of the light through media became much easier, right? And then there was me. I actually worked on these kind of things, and one of the hardest projects that I did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, was very dauntingly similar to this. And in fact, when the project started, I took Daniel, well, we were having a meeting with Daniel and Shri, and he's like, yeah, you know, guys, this will work, but it will be, 3 months to a year of gruesome CUDA coding. And so I just warned them, it's like, look, if you want to do this, yes, I think it will work, but just be prepared that this will require a long-term sacrifice, and there might be scooping along the way, and so on and so forth. But I think in a lab, you should always have like maybe some lower risk projects, but also some higher risk ones that could have a higher payday at the end of the process. So I was happy to support them in taking a lot more risk and giving them my support in doing so. As I said, it's like we were originally targeting, what was it? I think 3DV was the first deadline that we were trying to aim. That's kind of like closing the project. If you work in this area, you're stressed. That's basically, that's how it goes, right? Neural rendering and generative models and diffusions are not topics you should pick if you're not willing to cope with some stress. But yeah, first deadline was 3D, then we were trying to do it for CVPR, but then the guys were really, really keen in getting the performance to actually beat the DGS across the board. And so once we reached it, actually, they wanted to hold it back even more. They wanted to also have a 60 FPS browser viewer, so just in GLSL. And there was a time it's like, okay, fine, let's do that in a second moment. And yeah, let's close it here and have somebody else do it. So some other people actually built already viewers for the representation. In the first one came about 20 hours after we released the code online. So, and that was, of course, just like no optimization applied to representation at all, right? So it's an idea of where this could go eventually. Yeah.
So I'm interested in the distribution of your primitives.
Yeah.
For example, in Gaussian splatting, if you have hard edges, probably there are many Gaussians overlaid on top of each other to simulate this, or also if you have a continuous white wall, the many primitives will be used to represent this.
It's very similar.
The same.
The density will increase proportionally to the geometric density, so the amount of geometric detail, and with respect to the appearance density, of course. More texture surfaces will have more points and more sides in those locations, because there is no texture model attached to this, right? Like the entire appearance is stored within a vertex itself.
Is there maybe, do you think there's a specific nice way to regularize this representation that Gaussian splatting couldn't do?
I do, yeah. So again, ... I'm not going to say too much at this point, but yes, the answer is yes. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we're just about at the end of the time of the stream, so maybe you guys can also collect some of the questions to take offline. Thanks a lot, Andrea.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.